All right, I can just start with a little intro as usual, and then we can let David go. So welcome to our lecture series. This is our third, I think, of 2021, which is exciting. So we're Science in the News. We're a graduate student organization based at Harvard, and we organize a bunch of things, and amongst them is this lecture series that we do. They're almost every Wednesday. I can just start with a little intro as usual, and then we can let. All right. Basically, we're going to just a few logistics. The talk will be in three parts, and we'll take questions in the middle. But you can use the chat anytime. You can write your questions anytime, but we'll ask them at the breaks. And each section will be about 15 minutes. So keep that in mind, and hopefully we'll be done in like a little more than an hour. Yeah, I think that's it for the introductions. And you won't be able to unmute yourself, but you can write in the chat, and during the questions, you can unmute yourself. One more logistical thing. So we're live on YouTube and Zoom. So if you have Zoom issues, you can go to YouTube. If you have YouTube issues, you can come to Zoom. So both are there. And we're looking at both chats. So if you have questions, you can ask them through both chats, both the Zoom chat and the live chat on YouTube. So yeah. Without further ado, we're really excited about this talk, and I'll let David introduce himself and his topic.
Thanks, Busa. Hello, everyone. My name is David Mazumder, and I'm going to be telling you about your health, the climate, and what we can do about it in today's talk, Taking the Temperature. So I'm just a little bit of background about myself. I am a fourth-year MD PhD student at Harvard Medical School. That means I'm here for medical school as well as for a PhD in neuroscience. And I'm currently in the PhD phase of my training. And I hope someday to be a biomedical researcher and an academic physician at a hospital somewhere in the country. But today I'm going to be telling you about one of my passions outside of the clinic and outside of the lab, and that is climate change and how it intersects with our health. So we're going to start with just a brief review of the greenhouse effect and how that contributes to climate change, what climate change means for our health. Then we'll take our first break. We'll have some time for questions. And then we can talk about how climate solutions could save the planet and improve public health. And then we'll have a second break before we discuss some of the most impactful climate solutions using an interactive workshop format. And finally, we'll review some key takeaways. So I want to begin this story about global warming in a very, very cold place. This is not Boston from a few weeks ago, believe it or not. This is heroic science being done in Antarctica. These scientists are drilling for ice cores into the glacier. And these ice cores are then going to give them information about the history of the atmosphere, the history of gases, the gas composition of the atmosphere. The way that they do that is over time, as snow falls, some of it melts every year, but some of it stays, especially in the coldest parts on Earth, like in the mountains, like in Greenland, like in Antarctica. And as more and more snow builds up year over year, it compresses until it forms these gigantic ice sheets that we call glaciers. But between each layer of snow, there's a layer of air that is trapped. And that layer of air is exactly the air that was in the atmosphere at the time of that snowfall. And so if you drill deep enough into these glaciers, then you can have a record of the composition of the atmosphere from the time of that snowfall. And so these scientists take these ice cores back to the lab, they crack them open very carefully, and they measure exactly what gases are present in what quantities within each layer of the ice. And from that, we can construct a history of both the composition of gases in the atmosphere, as well as the average temperature of the planet that year, based on how thick the snow layer is between layers of air bubbles. The reason for that being that if you have on average a hotter year, you're going to have less snow that stays frozen through the summertime, and vice versa. If you have a colder year, more of it will stay. So you'll have thicker layers. So you can put these two pieces of information together and put together this time series, this timeline of both the carbon dioxide here in blue and the Earth's average temperature here in gray. And what we see is that these two quantities, the amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, this is one of the gases in the Earth's atmosphere, and the temperature of the planet are very closely related. When one goes up, the other goes up. When the one goes down, the other goes down. And the other thing to notice here is that for the past almost 1 million years, about 800,000 years, this record goes back based on the data that we have available today from these glacial cores. You can see that the carbon dioxide concentration stays limited between about 180 parts per million to a maximum of around 300 parts per million. And the temperatures range in between about 2 degrees Celsius greater than we see than we've seen in the modern era to about 3 or even 4 or 5 degrees Celsius cooler than in the modern era. But there's something going on here on the right-hand side with these lines that shoot up off the page. Let's take a closer look. So if we're zooming in just on the past 1,000 years of history, we can see that for most of that period, the carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere has been fairly static until we get to the year around 1900, and then accelerating throughout the 21st century. This is the carbon dioxide concentration. Whereas before we saw that in the historical record for the past 800,000 years, the maximum amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was around 300 parts per million. Today, there are 415 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, those parts per million doesn't sound like a big number, but fractionally, that is a huge increase over the historical maximum. And we're in uncharted territory for as long as modern humans have lived on this planet. Just like we saw before when you have an increase in carbon dioxide, you also see an increase in temperature. We have also begun to see a warming world due to this rapid increase in carbon dioxide, where today we're sitting around 1.2 degrees Celsius above the average temperature before the industrial era, this last century or so. How is this happening? How does carbon dioxide heat up the planet? So this is the greenhouse effect, right? The sun sits about 93 million miles away from the Earth, and it takes about 8 minutes and 17 seconds for a ray of light shown by the sun to hit the planet. When it does so, some of that light bounces off the atmosphere and goes back out into space. Some of it travels all the way down to the surface of the Earth and is absorbed, such as through solar panels or through plants that use that light to produce energy. Some of it is reflected back out into space, into the atmosphere. When it's that light, that heat, that energy that is reflected back out into the atmosphere can interact with certain gases in the atmosphere, just based on their chemical properties. One of those gases is, of course, carbon dioxide. And when carbon dioxide absorbs this light that is being reflected off of the surface of the Earth in the atmosphere, it can then re-emit it back down to the surface of the Earth in the form of heat, therefore trapping the light between the surface of the Earth and the upper atmosphere. And so this allows the Earth to save some of the energy from the sun. And carbon dioxide is, of course, one of our greenhouse gases, but there are others. One of the most famous is water. So clouds are a greenhouse, water is a greenhouse gas, and clouds, just like when you step outside on a summer night and the clouds are hanging low in the sky, it might feel warmer than on a clear night when the clouds are gone and they haven't been trapping as much heat locally close to the surface of the Earth. Another greenhouse gas that you might have heard of in the news is methane. This is something that comes from agriculture through especially the cultivation of livestock, like cows, sheep, other ruminants. And also from natural gas. It's a component of natural gas. It's a cousin of the propane that we use often for our grills or something like that. If you wanted to grill a steak in the summertime, this is that gas. It's a very potent greenhouse gas, meaning it is very effective at capturing the reflected light from the surface of the earth and re-emitting it back down, thereby saving that heat. Nitrous oxides are another chemical that is associated with heavy industry and agriculture that are emitted in relatively small quantities compared to carbon dioxide or methane, but they are also extremely potent greenhouse gases. And finally, halocarbons, or F gases, named because they have fluorine in them. So all of these gases are components of the atmosphere. Some of them, like nitrous oxides, halocarbons, and methane, are largely produced due to human activities. Carbon dioxide, as we'll get to in a moment, also, as we've seen, has been increasing over the course of the past 100 years due to human activities in its concentration in the atmosphere. All of these gases together produce the greenhouse effect and warm the earth. So before we saw that the amount of carbon dioxide that was present in the atmosphere was increasing rapidly over the course of the last 100 years. This is where it's coming from. So largely, it's coming from the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. And this is, you can see the growth in fossil fuels over time from the year around 1880, just recently to a few years ago. At the same time, human activities have been contributing to carbon dioxide emissions. This is the carbon dioxide that we emit that we produce from human activities, including the combustion of fossil fuels, the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, but also through land use change. So when you change the way that the surface of the earth is able to capture and store carbon dioxide, for example, plants suck up carbon dioxide as part of their energy capture and storage process, and they build up their bodies in the trunks of trees and other things to store that carbon dioxide. Some of that carbon dioxide makes it into the roots of the plants and is stored then in the soil when those plants die. When we change the way that that land is used from something like a forest into something like a farm, or from something like a farm into some of this suburban or urban sprawl, then we are reducing the ability of that land to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in the soil, where it's not going to have the same effect on the warming planet as it would have if it were in the atmosphere, able to interact with light and heat and the Earth's energy system. So there are emissions that are coming from land use change. These have been fairly constant, right? The thickness of this band is fairly similar all throughout this history, looking vertically. But the biggest difference really in the last 100 years has been the growth of coal, oil, and natural gas. These fossil fuels have implications for our health. I know this is not something that is necessarily talked about as much in the news. Often people are thinking about this as an environmental issue, that we have to worry about species that are going extinct, or people see this as an economic issue. We can talk about green jobs, or we can talk about the cost of transitioning the economy over to something that produces less carbon dioxide by burning less fossil fuels. But I think as a medical student, the health component is extremely important to me. And I'm just going to spend a little bit about talking about that. So when we have, just like we talked about already, we have increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels, such as through the burning of gasoline in cars. That leads to rising temperatures, as we've seen through the greenhouse effect. That leads to more extreme weather. So this is something that I think has been in the news a lot, especially in 2020. 2020 was a record-setting year. There were $22 billion natural disasters in the United States, which is a record-setting level since the federal government started tracking these billion-dollar disasters in 1980. That happens because whenever you add more heat, more energy to the Earth system, you're going to get more extreme weather events. Because you're going to get more wildfires, because there are going to be more droughts, more and longer and more severe droughts as weather patterns shift due to the increase in heat. You also have storms and flooding, hurricanes that occur because, in general, hotter air can hold more moisture and therefore create bigger storms, bigger storm clouds, and bigger storm systems that then can evolve into these hurricanes that smash into the Gulf and Atlantic coasts in this country and also around the world. And finally, you can also have rising sea levels with more heat. Part of the rising sea levels that we've seen over the last 50 years are due to the melting of glaciers, like the ones that we saw at the beginning of this talk. But some of it is also just due to the fact that when you heat the oceans, the volume of that water, the space that those oceans take up, increases. And so some of this rising sea levels are due to this thermal expansion, the heating up of the oceans that takes up more space. And some of it is due to the melting of glaciers that leads to there just being more water in the ocean. And all of these effects have health impacts. For example, we can look at water and food supply impacts. As you have more disasters that destroy sanitation systems in many cities, you can have a lack of water that is drinkable. Or if you have areas that are prone to drought, then you lose the ability to provide clean, drinkable water for your citizens. And similarly, these can have impacts on the food supply and lead to malnutrition as plants become more stressed out because they're living in a climate that they were not evolved or bred to grow in. Then many crops, including corn, rice, wheat, all of our cereals, these staple crops for cultures around the world, are just less nutritious. They hold fewer nutrients, fewer vitamins, and fewer calories. Severe weather, we've talked about this just a moment ago, where you can have actual death and injuries due to the extreme weather event, but also loss of homes, and that displaces people and leads to mental health impacts, including trauma, stress, anxiety, depression. We can have extreme heat, and we'll go into an example of this in just a second. But it makes sense that when you add more heat to the Earth system, there are going to be more days that are hot. And in some parts of the country, if you just shift the average temperature just a little bit, you're going to end up with many more days that have lethal heat. And so we'll talk about these. These heat-related illnesses in people can lead to cardiovascular failure and death. Cardiovascular failure meaning heart failure. And we talked about this environmental degradation, forced migration, and mental health impacts, again, due to these severe weather events and the inability to extract enough food from the land as the plants that you're growing, the crops that you're growing become more stressed in this different climate, different environment. And all of these effects have social dimensions as well, because the people who can least afford to adapt to provide for their families despite these environmental challenges are the people who are already the most vulnerable, the lowest income, the people who are most marginalized in society. And at the same time, aside from the extreme weather and impacts onto the food system, we also have changes in the environments that lead to expansions of regions where certain diseases can be found. And the reason for that is, if you think about it, where mosquitoes live, there are many areas in the country, like in Denver, Colorado, for example, where you don't really find mosquitoes. The city, Mile High City, it's too high, too cold, and not a good environment for these mosquitoes. But as the world warms, more of these areas that are not used to having mosquitoes, for example, will become suitable habitats for these insects that then will carry those same diseases that we usually think about as being tropical diseases into these new areas where they can now live. Some of these diseases include malaria, West Nile virus, Lyme disease. We'll go into some of the examples of this later. And we talked about the burning of fossil fuels being at the root cause of this whole system, this whole chain reaction here. And fossil fuels also produce air pollution. Air pollution in the form of ozone, in the form of carbon monoxide, in the form of soot. So when you burn something, you produce soot, and these very, very, very fine soot particles that are 20 times smaller than the size of a human hair can infiltrate the lungs. When people breathe in, then they'll go into the lung tissue, and they can actually pass through into your bloodstream and wreak havoc on people's arteries and blood vessels as they age. And so this is a big contributor to deaths globally, and it can also trigger asthma attacks, other respiratory diseases like COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And finally, we talked about water impacts as well. So these are again, similarly, if you warm the waters in new parts of the world, you're going to start to see more diseases that we usually think of as tropical diseases, as these microbes can migrate to new areas and infect people where they couldn't before. So let's talk about a couple of examples. One is that this is here pictured, we have an example from 1995 Chicago heat wave. In the span of 5 days, there was this incredible heat wave that struck the city of Chicago, and 739 people died in 5 days. There's another more recent example in 2019. In Paris, there were 2 heat waves that struck most of Europe and especially France in the summer of 2019. And these 2 heat waves combined killed 1,500 people just because of the heat. So these are folks who could not get to areas where they could cool themselves, where they didn't have access to air conditioning. And who are these folks who don't have access to air conditioning, who could not move to somewhere where they could cool themselves off? It's the folks who are least mobile, the elderly, the disabled, the people who can't afford air conditioning or who don't live in new enough buildings that had installed it are the poorest people, the people who live in poverty, lowest income households. And so these are the most vulnerable people in our society who are the most impacted when these incredible heat waves with temperatures greater than 90 degrees, greater than 100 degrees strike these major population centers. In fact, around the world, 300,000 people died in 2018 from heat-related illnesses, double the number that died in 2000. And again, these are mostly the elderly and the poor. How do people die from heat? It's when the body is unable to cool itself off any longer by sweating. For example, if people are not able to intake as much water and electrolytes and salts as they are producing in the form of sweat, then eventually your body loses the ability to continue to sweat. And at that point, the temperature rises, and that can cause heart failure. So another example that we mentioned earlier is this Lyme disease. So this is something that is particularly relevant to New England. In 1997, Lyme disease was largely concentrated in the tri-state area around New York City, and there was another focus in the upper Midwest. But by 2012, the ranges for Lyme disease had expanded to new areas of these regions, and especially large expansion to the north, where it was previously too cold for the deer tick, pictured here on the upper left, to live. But because of the changing climate, because of the warming, these warming habitats, the deer tick could migrate to these new areas and survive the cold winters because they were not as cold as they were before. And so we've seen a rapid increase in the amount of people who've been affected by Lyme disease in new areas where we had never seen it before. This is a huge problem in New England, especially because New England is the fastest warming region in the contiguous United States. We mentioned also water impacts. Here we have a picture of folks who are trying to prepare for the coming water shutdown in Cape Town, South Africa in 2018. In 2018, Cape Town hit what they call day zero, meaning the day when they no longer have water available for their population. And so this is a disaster. The authorities had to bus in water from other parts of the country. It was a huge expense and it was a huge humanitarian disaster because they have to distribute all of this water to all the people in the communities, and it can't be done. They don't have the supplies to do so through the traditional plumbing system. And so when as the world warms, as these climates shift, more cities, more large population centers are going to be affected by this kind of water shortage as droughts set in for longer and deeper. So at 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, again, remember we're at 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming right now. 4 billion people worldwide will be exposed to dangerous heat waves, as we just discussed, every year. And 3.3 billion people around the world will be left without consistent access to clean drinking water. If we let the world warm to 3 degrees Celsius greater than it was 100 years ago, then we will see that 7.9 billion people worldwide, this is in 2050, so the world population is expected to be around 9 billion people. So 7.9 billion people, almost 90% of the world's population, will be affected by dangerous heat waves every year. 3.9 billion people will be left without consistent access to clean drinking water. Currently, projections are that by the end of the century, we will hit 3.6 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels. This would be a humanitarian disaster. Let's take a breath. I know thinking about climate change in general is, and especially the implications for inaction, can be terrifying, frustrating, and it can make you scared and angry. And this is an extremely normal reaction. This is just how we are facing up to the reality of what sits ahead of us. But I think that the really promising thing here is something that we mentioned in the past few minutes, that the reason for climate change, the burning of fossil fuels, produces pollution. That also means that if we move away from fossil fuels to avoid climate disaster, we can also avoid many of the health impacts of those same fuels. And so we can transition our world from one that is heading towards disaster to one that is actually moving towards a healthier future than we have even today. So we'll talk about those solutions, how we can get there after the break. Welcome any questions that you have.
Yes, thank you, David. So if you're on YouTube, you can ask through YouTube chat. If you're on Zoom, you can type your questions in the chat. We'll wait a little to make sure we address all questions, and then we'll take a short break. So think about your questions. No questions. Everybody's just depressed. Oh, we have one question from Catherine. Could you please repeat what the prediction for temperature rise is by the end of the century?
So we're projected to hit 3.6 degrees Celsius, which is about 6.5 degrees Fahrenheit of warming above pre-industrial levels, so above the global average temperatures before the year 1850 by the end of the century.
That's frightening. I have a question. Are there new diseases that are created because of climate change? Well, like we talked about Lyme disease, for example, starting to spread more, but have there been a completely new thing that we hadn't heard of that happened because of climate change?
This is a great question, Busa. Thank you for that. So Most of the diseases that we are most worried about in public health in relation to climate change already exist, and we know, sort of what they are and how they affect people in many parts of the world. These are diseases like malaria, like dengue fever, like West Nile virus. These are all diseases that we normally would think of really only affecting people in the tropical regions of the world and subtropical regions of the world, like in many parts of Africa, India, Southeast Asia are most affected by malaria, for example. Many parts of South America and Latin America are affected by chikungunya, which is another one of these sort of tropical diseases, what we think of as tropical diseases. And really the biggest worry is that these diseases will spread to new areas and affect many, many more people than they already do because of the changing climate that makes it amenable to these diseases spreading to these other areas. But climate change does also mean that more animals are going to be moving to new parts of the world, just like these diseases move, just like mosquitoes move. Other animals have to live in a particular environment. And when that environment is changed by climate change, they have to pick up and move. And so many, this sort of mixing of animals in the environment is a risk factor for new diseases to arise as different populations of animals that carry different kinds of viruses, different kinds of microbes are moving from one place to another where they don't normally interact. Now suddenly these two viruses could be brought together and they can exchange components, little bits and parts of them, just like we've seen happen with the COVID-19 virus. And then, the fear is that then that could be transmitted to humans through contact with those animals somehow. And so the climate change is seen as a risk factor for producing new diseases that we've never seen before, and potentially pandemic diseases like we've been experiencing for this past year and a half. Thanks, Brisa. So how are we going to tackle this problem? How are we going to dig ourselves out of this situation here? So I think it first helps to understand where these emissions are coming from. 29% of carbon dioxide emissions are coming from the transportation sector, so trucking, cars, buses, etc. 28%, just a little bit less, from the electric sector. This is where we're generating our power. This is usually powered by a mix of nuclear power, coal, natural gas, and renewables like hydropower, solar, wind. 22% is coming from industry, meaning from the buildings that are housing a lot of the manufacturing and commercial sectors, as well as some direct processes of manufacturing that require the burning of fossil fuels, such as in the production of concrete and steel. Requires a lot of high heat, and so that heat is usually generated by the burning of coal. We also have 12% coming from commercial and residential districts and 9% from agriculture. So one thing that I think sticks out from this picture is that individually, there isn't that much that we can do to affect this problem. We personally cannot change where our home and our city and our whole neighborhood is getting electricity from, right? We don't have control over those power sectors. We don't have control over the fuel source that the buses that we take to work or that we send our children on to school, what fuel they run on. We don't have control over how our manufacturing areas in parts of our city are producing their steel and their concrete and many of their other industrial products. So it becomes a problem of thinking about how can we affect the whole system. And I know that's daunting, but I'm going to tell you about some of the promise that we can get from some of these solutions as well. So eliminating fine soot, these particles that are 20 times smaller than the width of a human hair, that are produced from the burning of fossil fuels, especially coal, but also other solid fuels like biomass and also oil, could save 8 million lives every year. Currently, 8 million people die every year due to diseases that are induced, that are caused by this fine soot pollution. And if we can move away from these sources of fuels, we can save all of those people. And even more than that, we can save all of the quality of life, all of the health of so many more people who are suffering because of that exposure to this pollution. You know, it's not just older adults who are suffering and dying from these diseases, but also it affects the way our youngest members of society as they're growing. So asthma is a disease of the lungs and the airway, where because of exposure to repeated exposure to certain irritants like air pollutants, just like these fine soot particles that we just talked about, or due to allergens like pollen, or some of it in part relates to genetic factors, but a lot of it is this mix, this balance of both exposure history, you know, whether you're living in areas that have a lot of these irritating compounds in the air, and some of it is relating to you know, your biological background. And so asthma causes the airways to thicken and therefore make it harder to breathe in these asthma attacks that people get upon exposure to some of these irritants or in particularly stressful situations. And then it afflicts 6.1 million children just in the United States, and it's one of the leading causes of school absenteeism. Obviously, if you're finding it hard to breathe, you don't feel like doing much. And so it's really tough for these kids. And the reason that children in particular are so affected by air pollutants and other, you know, environmental irritants is because kids have higher breathing rates because they're, you know, very active. You know, if you ever have your kid on your lap and you feel their heart rate, it's much higher than any adults as we're sitting down and resting. Children also have higher lung surface area to body weight ratios, and they also have much more immature immune and respiratory systems, so that it's harder for their bodies to process and deal with some of these things that they're exposed to in the air, whether it's pollen or whether it's air pollution in particular. So solving some of these problems of moving away from fossil fuel pollution can also benefit these kids who can learn better in school, who can live healthier lives, more active lives, and don't have to feel like they're tied to their inhaler when they're running around in the world. These effects, combined with some of the other benefits of moving away from fossil fuels, could bend that if we did enough of it, that would bend the warming curve to just less than 2 degrees Celsius, rather than the 3.6 degrees Celsius that we're heading for now, could save 300,000 American lives and $250 billion in expenses. Many of those expenses are from the healthcare savings, from not having to take care of so many people who were not made sick because we changed the way that we got our energy. We changed the way that we move ourselves around our cities. We changed the way that we manufacture products in this country. Now, aside from air pollutants that come along with the burning of fossil fuels, there are other aspects of the way that our society is structured today, such as if you go into a city, our cities are built for cars, right? We have these big, wide open roadways. We have huge highways that are coming in. And many cities in the country are not very pedestrian friendly. They're not very bike friendly. And it's tough to get around through these more active forms of transportation. Most Americans do not get the recommended 75 minutes of aerobic exercise every week that is recommended by the federal government. Heart disease is consequently the leading cause of death in the United States. 600,000 people die every year from heart disease. But if we could facilitate and encourage more of these active forms of transportation, then even people who don't have time to work out in their day because they're dealing with their kids' school and and they're working 2 jobs and all of these other factors that they have to take care of in their lives, just in getting through where they need to, getting to where they need to be, where otherwise they would be sitting on a bus or sitting in a car. If we can transform our cities to make it much more friendly towards biking and pedestrian, than like pedestrian walking around, then we can facilitate more people getting that exercise and reduce as well as reduce pollution from the fact that we are no longer burning fossil fuels to get from place to place. Instead, you're burning calories. Just putting some of these bike-friendly pieces of infrastructure, like the one pictured here in Portland, Oregon, in certain neighborhoods, in addition to green spaces, more parks and things like that, that can increase the number of people who are getting the recommended daily exercise by 25% in these neighborhoods. And it just shows the power of the way of thinking through the way both that we're getting around our cities and also how we're structuring and designing them, whether we're designing them for health or we're designing them for pollution. And so one other thing here that I think is often mentioned is plant-based diets. And when I say plant-based diets, I don't mean going totally vegan. What I do mean is reducing consumption of red meat and increasing consumption of plant-based protein sources. So things like tofu, legumes, nuts, all of these sources of plant-based protein that are much healthier, much lower in saturated fats, and therefore much healthier for both heart health as well as metabolic health. If we're talking about preventing diabetes and heart disease, these are essential, as well as preventing obesity overall. So this changing the way that we eat can be better for our people, but also it's a climate solution. So by reducing the amount of meat that we eat, we're reducing the pressure to form these gigantic factory farms that we have in much of the United States, or in other parts of the world, we're reducing the pressure to cut down forests, and especially tropical rainforests in Brazil, for example, so that farmers can use that land for livestock that will then be used to create these meat products. So in many parts of the world, we have these 2 forms of agriculture, these factory farms that crowd these animals together in close quarters and create ideal breeding grounds for diseases that then can be transmitted to people either through the food products that we derive from them or through their handlers, the people who care for these animals. Or in other parts of the world, the cutting down of these wildlands and converting them into farmland, the animals that used to live there that carry their own diseases then are interacting more frequently with the people who have moved into these spaces and can transmit diseases that way. And so, these shifting to plant-based diets that reduces the need for cutting down forests, which again are these carbon sinks, that reduces the need for these intensive animal agriculture in general that produces methane, as we mentioned earlier in the talk, another potent greenhouse gas. This is both a climate solution and a health solution for people in their diets and in the prevention of future pandemics. So there's a lot of promise in all of these solutions, both in tackling some of the drivers of climate change, as well as the drivers of chronic disease in people. And so there's a huge possibility to capitalize on this opportunity that we need to transition our economy away from fossil fuels, away from big sources of carbon and methane, away from intensive animal agriculture and all of these other features, and towards a system that is healthier, that prioritizes activity, that prioritizes green spaces and neighborhoods, that prioritizes healthier diets, and that prioritizes clean sources of energy that don't pollute the air that we breathe. And so this is a huge opportunity to tackle many of these problems at once. And I think these health benefits of all of these transitions are not often talked about in the conversation around climate change and its solutions. So I just want to pause there for questions again before we start tackling this last question of, okay, how do we get there now?
All right. So again, same thing. Please ask your questions in either the Zoom chat or the YouTube live chat, and we will get to them. I see one question. Are there any changes that would reduce our carbon footprint but not benefit humans or human health?
That's a good question. So I think this helps to sort of frame this question if we go back to thinking about where these carbon emissions are coming from. And in agriculture, there are certainly certain kinds of interventions that will sequester that will pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and put it into the ground, such as regenerative farming. I don't know if that's something that folks have heard about, regenerative agriculture. And this is the idea that rather than farming in a way that requires a lot of fertilizer to be brought in, a lot of extraction of nutrients from the ground to fuel this very unsustainable way of producing crops. Instead of that approach, invest in increasing soil health and thereby allow the natural ecosystem of the farmed crop to pull down carbon dioxide and store it in the soil in a way that doesn't require all these inputs from fertilizers, in a way that doesn't require as much even manufactured pesticides and herbicides and things like that. There's this alternative way of producing food that doesn't require all of the same resource intensiveness, the same production of carbon emissions, and it can actually sequester carbon, store carbon down, pull carbon down from the atmosphere and put it in the soil where it cannot be active as a greenhouse gas. That in and of itself does not directly benefit human health, but it is a climate solution, right? It does capture these greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. However, when thinking about all of these things, climate change itself impacts human health. And so any solution, even if it doesn't directly benefit human health, in the enactment of that solution will, by mitigating climate change, protect people's health in the future when we're talking about extreme weather events, wildfires, hurricanes, when we're talking about the spread of diseases to new places, when we're talking about exposure to heat waves and water and food stressors.
Awesome, thank you for that answer. We have another question. It kind of relates to the plot you were showing about the US gas emissions. But so there we show this country's emissions, right? But what do we do when there's many, many other countries? So should we try to sort of focus on advocacy in our own country? Or if we do great, but every other country is not doing great, will that affect us? So how should we approach this issue?
This is a great question. And this is so the United States today produces 15% of global greenhouse gases. However, the United States as a country has contributed to just about a quarter of global emissions, global greenhouse gas emissions produced by all humanity for its entire history. That's a bigger burden than any other nation in the history of the world. And so I think there's a moral case to be made that the United States needs to take aggressive action, and that any action that we can take here at home is, well, more than justified. There's a different question here about how does that affect the rest of the world, and can any emissions reductions in the United States actually make a difference when today we only account for 15% of the emissions that are going into the atmosphere every year. And I think being in the United States, we have a special privilege of being in a country that has chains of innovation and supply chains that are spread across the world. And so changing the way that we do business here in this country affects the way that nations all across the world do business. And I think the United States' diplomatic weight in the world means that if the United States can adopt an aggressive science-based plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then that's going to have an outsized effect on the conversation around the globe, and enable the United States to pull in more commitments from other nations. So we cannot directly affect other countries, but I think being in the United States gives us a huge opportunity to have an outsized impact, even if we're acting locally.
Awesome, thank you for that. And final section of our talk. So if you have burning questions, you should definitely write them in the chat, and then we'll get to them at the end. It's all yours, David. Thanks,
Musa. All right. So folks, how are we going to get to this future that is both healthier for our planet and healthier for our people? We're going to use En-ROADS. En-ROADS is a climate simulation tool that integrates economic indicators and models, as well as our best understanding of the climate system, coming from researchers at MIT's Sloan School of Management and its Sustainability Initiative, as well as the nonprofit think tank Climate Interactive. So one of the graphs that we're going to be looking at today, it uses data, incorporates all of this data to project into by the end of the century, what the change in temperature over pre-industrial levels will be. So as we mentioned before, here in 2020 today, this is historic data from 2000 to 2020, and we're just about 1.2 degrees Celsius. By the end of the century, we're projected to hit 3.6 degrees Celsius. Our goal is to bend this curve to fit between these two gray lines. This is the 2 degrees Celsius and the 1.5 degrees Celsius targets for restraining global warming to within those limits that were set forth by the 2015 Paris Climate Accords. So at the same time, we can look at where we're getting our energy. So again, thinking back to how we're producing these carbon dioxide emissions, much of it comes from the burning of fossil fuels. Today in 2020, fossil fuels around the world make up the vast majority of the sources of our energy. Right here, blue, we have in natural gas. In red, we have oil, and in brown, we have coal. And these other renewable or carbon neutral sources of energy include nuclear, bioenergy, and renewables like hydroelectricity, solar, wind power. So we're going to be looking at these graphs, and how can we actually affect those? How can we bend these curves? Well, we can change the way that we incentivize or tax all of these different technologies. So for example, if we start with energy supply, this includes our fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. And so we're in the simulator, we're going to be able to move this slider around. And so I want you all to think about, as we're discussing some of these options for changing our energy mix, changing the way that the global economy works, what are you most interested in seeing? Like, which of these levers would you want to pull? And we'll discuss this. It'll be an interactive portion in just a second. So we also have, of course, our zero energy sources, our renewables like wind, solar, hydroelectricity, nuclear power, some new zero carbon technology. And the idea behind this is that if there's something that we could invent in the next 5 to 10, 20 years, like nuclear fusion or thorium fission, some new way that we don't have today of producing zero carbon electricity. And finally, a carbon price. And so the idea there is that it changes the energy supply by making it much more expensive to pollute, to put all of this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere by tacking a price onto that activity. Then we can also change the way that we use energy, our energy demand. So in our transportation sector, if we electrified our transportation sector by having lots of electric vehicles, or we can incentivize energy efficiency in our transportation sector. What does that look like? That looks like incentivizing active transport, like through biking and pedestrian walkways. We can increase the use of mass transit, decrease the use of single occupancy vehicles, increase the use of hybrid vehicles. All of these interventions increase the energy efficiency of our transportation sector. Similarly, we can look at the buildings and industry. We can electrify buildings and industry. Many of us have in our homes natural gas stoves or natural gas furnaces, or people use heating oil across New England. And again, I mentioned that often the production of concrete and steel uses the burning of coal. So if we can find a way to electrify many of these processes, or if we can incentivize energy efficiency in buildings and industry, this will also change our use of fossil fuels and energy overall. So energy efficiency can look like insulating our buildings better, using more energy efficient appliances, etc. And finally, of course, if there are fewer people on Earth, or if we have a smaller global economy, we're going to demand less energy. And so these are other ways that we can affect energy demand. And finally, we can directly pull down carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere by changing the rate of deforestation across the world. We can reduce the amount of deforestation through better conservation practices. We can reforest or afforest parts of the world that don't currently have trees. And this can result in the pulling down of carbon dioxide by these new forests and storing it in the soil and storing it in the bodies of their trunks so that it can no longer act as a greenhouse gas. Similarly, we can use a technological solution to do the same, where we're pulling down carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And we can do other interventions, including change the way that our agricultural system works, or changing the way that our industry produces some of these other gases that we talked about, nitrous oxides and halocarbons, these F gases. So these are ways that we can actually remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere or prevent them from being emitted in the first place. So with that as our background, let's migrate over to the simulator. This is exactly what we were just looking at a moment ago, where we are, this is our temperature change chart, where we're here in 2020. We're right about 1.2 degrees Celsius, and we're currently heading towards 3.6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. We're going to bend this curve by messing with some of these sliders. I hope you've all been thinking about what you would like to see, and we're going to see how that changes the global energy mix on this left-hand side of the graph. So please put into the chat now what you would like to see. Do you have a favorite climate solution? Is there something that your neighbor has been bugging you about? Have you read something in the news recently? What would you like to see modeled in our simulator as one of these solutions? Okay, I see one suggestion here that's for bike transportation. If we were to incentivize biking, maybe by making our roads safer, by implementing a city bike share program. This is a great suggestion. Thank you. And so this would fall under energy efficiency, right? So if we were able to make it so that people are spending less energy, burning fewer fossil fuels to get to where they need to go, then that's improving the energy efficiency of our transportation sector. Let's move that up to highly increased portion. And we can see again what that did. Okay, so what happened? So we reduced the amount of oil, especially, right? This oil bar is decreasing. Most of the others are unaffected. Most of the other energy sources are unaffected. And at the same time, we're bending this curve. The blue is representing the scenario that we're simulating right now. We're bending this curve down such that by the end of the century, we've shaved off 1/10 of a degree Celsius of warming. All right, we've begun our journey. So we're part of the way there. I think for the sake of argument, let's see what happens if we were going to push this all the way up, right? And now we see that gets us another 1/10 of a degree Celsius. This is it might be surprising, right? That if we were to ramp up the energy efficiency of our transportation sector to such a degree that, it was so easy to bike wherever you wanted to go across the country. We were incentivizing public transit. We were doing all of the solutions that affect energy efficiency of our transportation sector. That would only get us to 0.2 degrees Celsius less than we otherwise would. Right. I think this is starting to click that we're going to need an array of solutions in order to tackle this problem, even if we max out across the whole sector and across the globe. So we have some other suggestions here. Think about afforestation. What if we were to reforest large parts of the world? So if we bring this slider all the way up to the right-hand side here, max it out, that would mean that we would be reforesting a land area about twice the size of India, which is not a small country. And that amounts to about 700 billion trees around the world, which is very close to the amount that scientists have said about 1 trillion trees there actually is available for land in the world. And we can so let's see what happens when we do this. Okay, if we max out, if we plant 700 billion trees around the world, we get another 1/10 of a degree Celsius. Okay, what's happening over here? Nothing is happening over here. We haven't affected our energy system, right? This is actually affecting directly the carbon emissions. And just to get a better look at that, I'm just going to quickly move to a new graph. So here, just to get oriented, now we're looking at carbon dioxide emissions, right? And now we're looking at where these emissions are coming from. So some of the emissions, just like we said before, are coming from land use change. Some of it is coming from the burning of fossil fuels from energy. Some of it is coming from in the form of methane and these other gases, like these F gases, these nitrous oxides. So these are the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And when we replant trees across the world, where before land use was actually contributing, the way that we are changing the surface of the earth is actually contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, then by replanting 700 billion trees around the world, we can actually make land use a net negative carbon sink around the world. The problem is that this is coming too late in the game, right? Even if we were going to start this big reforestation program today, then it would take time to secure the land for this reforestation project. It would take time to plant the trees. It would take time for those trees to grow up and mature to be their maximum carbon capturing and sequestering form, these mature forests. And so all of that means that the effect of these trees actually acting as a carbon sink comes so late in the century, right around 2060, that it only saves us 1/10 of a degree Celsius in warming by the year 2100. So this is important, thinking about these time scales. So we have another suggestion here about electric cars, and we have another suggestion about renewables. So these are great. So if we were to subsidize renewables all the way, let's put it all the way to the max, highly subsidized. So that means that we're adding about 3 cents per kilowatt hour of a discount to the renewable energy, the cost of renewable energy. So now just bear with me on this side as I go back to our temperature change, just so that we can get oriented here. So what happened when we subsidize renewables? We see that there's a huge expansion in the renewables uptake. That's great, right? That means more of our electricity is coming from renewables, less of it is coming from coal and natural gas. But for some reason, that's only saving us another. And now I've gone back to twice, but that's only saving us an additional 1/10 of a degree Celsius. And the reason for that is that if we look at, for example, just bear with me as I switch here for 1 sec. Okay, so if we look at the marginal cost of electricity production. So this is looking at how much money it takes to produce that much more electricity, right, dollars per kilowatt hour. So even in 2020, right now we have wind and solar are pretty much on par with the cost of getting electricity through the burning of coal and natural gas. And if we project into the future, even without this subsidy, the renewables are projected to become the cheapest energy source within a few years, right? And by subsidizing it, we're making it that much cheaper, but it means that that there are some parts of the world where it's just always going to be cheaper to use coal and gas, as long as they're available. because that we've by making renewables that much cheaper, we're not necessarily changing. We're not getting to these hard to reach areas where sort of maybe close to the sources of these plentiful fossil fuels like coal and gas. Okay, and then we mentioned electrification of vehicles, right? So let's say we electrify these vehicles. Now, what do we mean if I bring this all the way over to the right? If I'm maxing this out, so this means that at baseline, if there were no other policy interventions, we would expect that 20% of the world's transportation sector would be electrified by the year 2100. By maxing this out to be an increase in 5% per year, now we're getting up to somewhere around 67, almost 70% of the world's transportation sector is electrified by the year 2100. So this is a massive increase in the amount of electrification. And what happens? Okay, let me just reset this guy back to where we were before. Okay, and now let's see what the effect of this electrification of cars was. Okay, we are decreasing the amount of oil use, and it looks like we're increasing the amount of renewables, right? We're not really increasing so much the coal and gas because again, renewables are already cheaper than coal and gas. And by electrifying cars, we're reducing our demand for oil in the form of gasoline. And so that saves us another 1/10 of a degree Celsius. All right. This is great. We got another 1/10 of a degree Celsius saved here. So I think I think it's pretty clear at this point that as long as our energy mix is staying the same, relatively similar with coal, oil, and natural gas as a huge portion of the energy market, that if we demand more electricity, or we could make renewables cheaper, even though they're already the cheapest option, this is going to have a limited impact on the amount of carbon emissions. So let's see. I think we've got a couple of suggestions here for a carbon price. So what happens if we bring up a carbon price? Let's make this very high for the sake of argument, right? Okay. All right, so that got us 0.7 degrees Celsius. That's the biggest impact that we've seen so far. And what happened? We have a huge expansion of renewables. We have a massive decrease in the amount of coal, oil, and natural gas that we're using. And part of the reason for that, again, if we bear with me as I change graphs here, if we look at the cost of electricity, by implementing this carbon price, we're massively increasing the amount of money that it takes to produce coal, oil, and natural gas, right? So now not only are we depressing the price of renewables by this subsidy, but now we're also making it more expensive to use these polluting fuels, to use these carbon intensive fuels. And we see the steepest increase in coal. And the reason for that is that coal is the most carbon intensive energy source. It has about twice the amount of carbon dioxide per unit of energy as does natural gas. So if we just reset this back to where we were looking at before, what does this mean for a carbon price? This means we're looking at a carbon price of about $250 per ton. This is huge, right? Today, there are systems in place in Europe, there are systems in place in California and Canada, and most of those carbon prices are in the range of $20 to $40 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted. And so a price of $250 per ton is actually, an order of magnitude 10 times greater than any of the carbon prices that we have today. And so this could, if we have a carbon price like that, this is a game changer. Right now, at this point, we're already down to 2.4 degrees Celsius. It had a massive impact on the global economy. But the thing is, it's so much more than what we have today. And I think one of the ways to get at this is if we use, instead of this massive increase over the course of 10 years, as it's implemented here in the model right now, if we have a steadily rising carbon price instead, right? So, and I see we have a question in the chat that I'm going to get to in just a moment. But if instead we start with a low carbon price, right, about $15 per ton, and then let's say we start with that $15 per ton right away, and let's say we start a steadily increasing carbon price right away over the course of the rest of the century, such that we have a steadily rising carbon price like this, right? So it's a linearly increasing carbon price, meaning that every year it just gets that much more expensive to pollute carbon. And what we see is that if we do this sort of gradual impact that might be a little bit more politically feasible, as well as less of a shock to the global economy, but that it ultimately ends up with a much higher carbon price, then this yields an even stronger effect, right? Where we have a greater uptake of renewables, and coal is nearly eliminated. And just to bring that home, I do want to revisit one graph in particular, which is my favorite. Being a medical student, I want to look at air pollution. This relates to some of the topics that we were just talking about before, where at baseline, we're projected to see increase in air pollution over the course of the century as more coal is utilized. But if we are able to eliminate coal production, coal is the source of most of these PM 2.5, this particulate matter, 2.5 microns, meaning the fine soot that we were talking about that triggers asthma attacks, that triggers cardiovascular disease, that triggers COPD, that these kinds of interventions are exactly the kinds of things that will save people's health. Similarly with the biking, similarly with increasing green spaces, this is transformative for people's health in addition to the planet. Now there's a question here, stop eating red meat. So we're not quite to 2 degrees Celsius yet. So let's see what it will take to get there. So if we go into our methane and other gases, then let's reduce these down to high reduction. So that is enough to save us to maintain warming at a limit of 2 degrees Celsius through the end of this century. And the reason for that, again, let's just check out this graph here. Before we implemented that change, notice where most of our carbon emissions are coming from. Most of our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from by the end of the century, after we implemented this carbon tax. It's mostly coming from methane and these other gases. So that's the last sector of the economy that we really needed to tackle. And so by reducing this in an aggressive way, then that allows us to reduce our carbon footprint there, and we're limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius by the end there. So I know there have been a couple of questions that have come up in the course of this talk. I want to, just for the sake of time, move on to wrapping up here. I think congratulations, everyone. We have a limited warming to 2 degrees Celsius through the course of our interventions. And we're just going to migrate back over to our presentation to wrap up. So I just wanted to ask you all to put into the chat, what surprised you about this exercise? I think there are some counterintuitive findings that we discovered together here. What was most surprising to you? So ask yourself that. If you're comfortable, feel free to put it in the chat. Okay. So I think some of the key takeaways here are that we can still solve this problem, right? We can still solve the climate crisis. We can do so with today's technology and today's know-how. We did not rely on any unproven technologies in the course of implementing these changes, right? We did not rely on some new zero carbon technology like nuclear fusion. We did not rely on some untested technology like direct air carbon capture that is not currently economically viable, right? We relied on some of these exactly the solutions that we talked about, the ways that they can also improve health. And none of these solutions, however, is enough to solve the problem by itself. And one way I like to remember this is that you can't plant a garden with only one seed. However, we did notice that not all solutions are created equal, right? By changing behavior today, by making it more expensive to pollute today, by enabling people to save energy today, by changing the way that we we build our roads and allow people to bike around and things like that. Notice that the most impactful solutions that we discussed today were this carbon price and also the energy efficiency interventions. Those were the two most impactful solutions. And those both change the way, rely on the changing people's behavior today with our current energy mix, because that accumulates benefits over the course of the century. So that will, every avoided emission that you start avoiding today builds up over time and has a massive impact. Whereas any new infrastructure, any new technology, anything new that you have to grow, whether it's in the ground or build, like new infrastructure for renewables, new installation of electric vehicle charging stations, all of these kinds of things, that requires time. It requires time to develop the technology, to roll it out, to subsidize, to buy the land, for the trees to grow. For all of these things, it requires time. And these technologies are also important, right? We would not have gotten to the 2 degrees Celsius limit without all of them together. But it is really important that we change behavior today to accumulate benefits over time. And bear in mind that some of these other technological and infrastructure-based projects require time to roll out. So just to review all of what we talked about today, we covered a lot of ground. Thanks for sticking around to the end here. We talked about the greenhouse effect and how these greenhouse gases contribute to global warming. We saw where these greenhouse gases are coming from human activities, and primarily from the burning of fossil fuels. And we saw that climate change itself has huge implications for health, whether it's access to clean water, access to nutritious food, changing disease ecology, where these diseases are located, whether it's in our water or in these insect vectors like our tick here on the screen, and also just even due to extreme weather events, droughts, wildfires, hurricanes, and heat waves. At the same time, the burning of fossil fuels itself contributes to air pollution and affects both children and the elderly, two of our most vulnerable populations, in the form specifically of asthma and exacerbation of cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. But at the same time, with these interventions that affect both climate change and pollution can create a more livable world where we can live with improved health. And that includes everything from the way that we practice agriculture, to the way that we get around, to the way that we power our cities, to the way that we manufacture our goods. These are all solutions that are necessary to solving this problem. Almost all of them have these co-benefits of both solving the climate problem and improving health. And so to me, this leaves me in a very hopeful place that the world that we need to create, that we must create, is also a world that will be a better one to live in. So I think some of us are asking ourselves now, how can I help? What can I do? And I think the highest individual impact, according to Project Drawdown, which is, if you go to the SITN website, is listed in the handout there. Project Drawdown is an evidence-based guide to what is the relative impact of many of these different solutions. And really, the biggest individual thing that people can do is change their diet. Eat a little bit less red meat every week. And see what happens. See how you like it, and see what kind of an impact you can make. And the way that we change the way that we deal with our food waste in particular, because when food goes to a landfill, it degrades into methane, one of these greenhouse gases that we've been talking about, and contributes to climate change, global climate change, versus if we are able to compost it, that actually goes back into the ground, right? That carbon dioxide goes back into the soil, into this rich compost that is perfect for gardening and farming. And so the ways that we handle our food in particular is a huge way that we ourselves can impact this problem. But, if you're able, be a model for your neighborhood. Oftentimes there's a psychological barrier, or there's a barrier like you don't know anybody who's done this kind of thing, or you don't know, what the right contractor would be to hire if you've never done this before. So there's often a barrier to starting this kind of move to, for example, putting solar panels on your roof, or re-insulating your home, or investing in a electrified heat pump or an electric stove rather than a gas stove. All of these interventions you can be a model for your neighborhood, that can make a big difference on a community level. But honestly, the ways that, exactly as we talked about before, the ways that we're going to solve this problem is through collective action and through systemic change. And so for that reason, it's really important that we give a little bit of our time to join a movement to take collective action. I personally volunteer with the Citizens Climate Lobby, arguing for a carbon price. There are also other great organizations doing fantastic work in this space, including 350 Mass, which is arguing for 100% renewable energy in Massachusetts, as well as other justice-oriented measures, given, just as we discussed before, that climate change impacts the most vulnerable the most. And Sunrise Movement similarly has a justice-focused mission, as well as arguing for the creation of green jobs and green industries. So all of these organizations do fantastic work. And I think if you can give a little bit of your time to any of these, then that is really going to make the biggest difference as we move our society from one that is polluting our planet and our people to one that is livable. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, David. That was fascinating. We already have some questions, but keep writing your questions in the chat. This is our last portion of the talk, so this is the last time to ask questions, but I will also post in the chat our feedback form. It's a very short 1-minute form. So if you can give us feedback for what do you want to hear next? How did today go? Those kinds of things, we would very much appreciate it. So now, question time. One is from Cynthia. This was while we were working on the simulator. How is carbon price different from cap and trade carbon tax?
Okay. This is a great question. So this is getting a little bit deep into the policy weeds here, but bear with me. So a carbon price just means that it costs money to put carbon out into the atmosphere, right? Right now, there are all of these industries, and anytime you burn fossil fuels, right, you're just pumping pollution basically into the atmosphere, the air that we breathe and the atmosphere that determines the climate of our planet. By putting a price on carbon, we are accounting for those environmental, collective, and health effects. And so there are a couple of ways that you can put a price on carbon. By making it more expensive to just shove carbon dioxide into the atmosphere without any regard for these other impacts. One is through cap and trade system, like it currently exists in Quebec, in our neighbor to the north, and California and the European Union. So this cap and trade system basically puts a cap on the pollution that's allowed to be produced every year, in this case, carbon dioxide. And that cap is falling every year, right? So there's a decreased amount of carbon dioxide that is allowed to be produced in the economy that is subject to this cap. And there are, that cap is composed of permits to pollute, permits to produce carbon dioxide to release into the atmosphere. And those permits are auctioned off to companies. And so companies that rely on burning fossil fuels at the moment will need to buy a lot of these permits. And so the purchasing of these permits is the place where a price is applied to the act of pushing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, right? That this happens in a secondary market. So the thing that is controlled is the cap on pollution, and the price is established through the trading of these permits, the auctioning of these permits through this extra market. Versus a carbon tax just says that, there's a certain cost associated with polluting the carbon this year, right? For example, $15 per ton or $250 per ton. That anytime you produce carbon dioxide, you're gonna have to pay that tax. And that's where the price comes in. So there's less control over the amount of carbon dioxide that is emitted into the atmosphere, but you're instead controlling for the price that polluters actually see as they're pushing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So there's two different approaches that both establish a carbon price. The one that we modeled directly in En-ROADS was a carbon tax. There are other, depending on what you do with the revenue of that carbon tax, it could be used for infrastructure projects. It could be used for assistance for communities that have lost jobs because of this transition into the new economy, or it could be, direct payments out to households in a sort of dividend system. So this carbon fee and dividend is something that the Citizens Climate Lobby, like I mentioned, argues for on the federal level.
Awesome, thank you so much. There's one other question. So we did have a comment about like how politicians don't talk about what's effective, but do they look at these simulators? How do they make decisions when they're trying to, I mean, we might not know everything, but do we know of politicians that look at these kinds of things and try to make decisions based on more science-based sort of predictions on how our decisions might affect our future?
Yeah, I think this speaks to a larger problem about scientific literacy in our decision makers in this country, and I think there you can spend hours sort of dissecting where that comes from and how big an issue that is and which issues that affects most. But one thing that I think that in particular relates to En-ROADS, the simulator that we use today, is that Climate Interactive, the think tank that keeps En-ROADS up to date in line with the best science that we know, has done presentations with their partners on the MIT faculty with several members of Congress already. So some members of Congress are seeing this data. I think it's important that more of them do. Not everybody's aware of it. But there are also other political effects here, right? So there are ways that people perceive a carbon tax or something like that, or others of these, like direct air capture of carbon dioxide or reforesting large parts of the earth. There are people who say, where are you going to find that land? The land in this area of the country is traditionally used for agriculture, or the land in this area of the country is like very highly priced for real estate development. And so there are all kinds of other political factors that come in here. Or, for example, there are folks who worry about the impact of a carbon price on low-income households. How are people who already are barely able to make their electricity and heat payments every month, how are they going to afford it when all of these the way that we produce our electricity becomes so much more expensive when you put a price on carbon? So these concerns that are legitimate concerns, I think, affect the way that many decision makers are seeing this problem and these solutions. And the challenge then is, how do you construct a policy that is able to take into account all of these different concerns, and how can you educate lawmakers about this? And so I think those two challenges are exactly what these collective organizations like Citizens Climate Lobby, like 350 Mass, like Sunrise Movement are trying to figure out how to do. How can they educate lawmakers about the benefits and the ways that we can address these concerns, and then how can we make it possible for them to support it?
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. I think that's it for the questions that we have, but we'll stick around for like a minute or two in case you have lingering questions. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you next week. Next week, we'll have a lovely talk, 3 short talks on spacecraft with superpowers. That's the topic of our 3 talks. So hope to see you then.
Terrific. Thanks, everyone.